Ever wonder what really goes on during an ADHD evaluation?
Mhm.
You're in for a treat today. We've got Daniel's actual psych evaluation. Pretty rare insight, right? Especially since his story really highlights how ADHD, especially the inattentive type, can go unnoticed for years, even decades.
Totally. It's like having all the clues but not knowing how to solve the mystery. But luckily, that's where you come in, helping us put the puzzle pieces together, connecting what we know about Daniel, those test results, and, well, what it all means, right?
Absolutely. So for starters, we know Daniel sought help because work stress and anxiety were getting to be too much. He was doing well as a UI designer, a field that plays to his strengths, but a shift into project management, that had him feeling totally overwhelmed.
It makes sense, doesn't it? Project management requires a completely different set of skills. Organization, planning, that juggling act of managing multiple tasks, not exactly known for being strong points for people with ADHD, especially the inattentive type.
Exactly. And here's something that really struck me when I was reviewing his file. Daniel actually describes himself as a data gatherer and analyzer, someone who really needs like solid facts and struggles with folks who maybe rely a bit more on intuition or feeling.
Interesting. Is there a connection there, you think?
I think so. It's something I've noticed in my own work. This preference for logic, objective information, thriving on structure, clear evidence, can be both a strength and a challenge.
So you're saying it's not just a personality quirk, it could be linked to how his brain actually works.
Exactly. And it might be why he was initially drawn to UI design, which, when you think about it, involves a lot of problem solving, attention to detail.
Fascinating. Okay, so how did Daniel even get to the point of suspecting ADHD in the first place?
Well, like many, he had always struggled with certain things. For example, mediocre grades, despite being really smart, needing to juggle multiple tasks to feel productive, and, that classic difficulty focusing on things that don't grab his interest.
Oh man, does that sound familiar? It's easy to brush those things off, right?
Right.
Just tell yourself, well, that's just me. That's just how I am.
Absolutely. It's so common. And that's why having these conversations, destigmatizing these experiences, is crucial. Now, here's another layer. Daniel also wondered about autism. He mentioned sensory sensitivities, feeling socially different, so that was on his radar too.
So he was thinking maybe ADHD or maybe autism.
Yeah, and that happens a lot, right? People relate to parts of different diagnoses. That's why we can't stress enough how important thorough testing and what's called differential diagnoses are. It's about the whole picture, not just checking off symptoms on a list.
Right, context is everything. And speaking of the whole picture, let's dig into those test results. What can you tell us about Daniel looking at those?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is his IQ. He scored a 130. That puts him in the top 2% intellectually.
Wow, talk about brilliant.
No doubt. And here's why this is so important. It challenges a common misconception about ADHD: high intelligence. It doesn't mean you can't also have ADHD. In fact, sometimes it masks the struggles.
It's like you've got this powerful engine, but the brakes are kind of, well, wonky. You can still go fast, but staying in control, that becomes the issue.
Perfect way to put it. So, in Daniel's case, his executive functioning, while average, was actually weaker than we'd expect given that sky-high IQ. That discrepancy is a major red flag.
So the IQ test showed his potential, but those executive function tests, they were like, hold on, let's see where the real challenges lie.
Exactly. Now, when we say executive functioning, we're talking about this whole set of cognitive skills: planning, organization, initiating tasks, time management, staying focused, basically. All the things that help us navigate, well, life.
And these are where Daniel was hitting a wall, despite being so intelligent.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got Daniel's own description of his struggles, this major gap between his IQ and how those executive functions are working. What else did those tests reveal?
Well, there was the CIRS-SL, basically, a standardized questionnaire about ADHD symptoms and his self-reported symptoms, clinically significant. But here's where it gets really interesting. A close friend also filled out this questionnaire, about Daniel.
Oh, wow. Okay. And did their observations line up with what Daniel was saying?
It did flag potential ADHD, but the friend rated it as less severe than Daniel himself did. And that's actually a really common pattern. We tend to judge ourselves much more harshly than others do.
Right. It makes you wonder if maybe Daniel had developed some pretty impressive coping mechanisms over the years, enough so that others didn't see the full extent of what was going on, even though he was still struggling internally.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It really emphasizes how important it is to look at things from multiple angles to get the full picture.
Makes total sense. Now, before we move on to the actual diagnosis, let's circle back to that autism question. You mentioned that Daniel identified with some autistic traits, like the sensory issues, but the testing didn't support ASD. What were they seeing that ruled that out?
Well, throughout the testing, Daniel consistently demonstrated strong social interaction skills. He made eye contact, expressed his emotions openly, and engaged in conversations really naturally. That back and forth flow we expect.
So it wasn't just about how he answered questions on paper. They were watching how he actually interacted in real time.
Precisely. He did find some social interactions a bit draining, and let's be real, that's true for a lot of us, right? But the key is he could articulate those feelings and clearly understood the social dynamics at play.
So that self-awareness and ability to reflect on those experiences is a good sign. What about his love for tech gaming? Could that be seen as a restricted interest, which can be common in autism?
It's definitely an area of interest we often see in both ADHD and autism, especially in folks who are gifted. But for Daniel, it's also his job and a way he connects with others.
Ah, okay. So it's not just a solitary thing, but something that actually brings him into contact with other people.
Exactly. It all comes back to context, looking at the why behind those interests, not just labeling them at face value.
So after all those tests, all that analysis, what was the final verdict? What did they determine was going on with Daniel?
Well, based on everything they gathered, Daniel received 2 diagnoses: generalized anxiety disorder, GAD for short, and ADHD, specifically the inattentive type. And honestly, it's not unusual to see those 2 go hand in hand.
They seem like they go together often.
Giving anxiety and ADHD.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And in Daniel's case, the psychologist believed that his anxiety was actually being made worse by those job demands that were tapping into his executive function weaknesses, kind of creating this perfect storm.
Oh, wow, a vicious cycle. Right. So ADHD makes certain tasks harder, which then ramps up the anxiety, which then makes it even harder to deal with those tasks.
You got it. It's a bit like trying to run a marathon, but you've got a sprained ankle, It's not impossible, but it takes so much more effort, and it could lead to further injury down the line. It really highlights how important it is to understand how these diagnoses can overlap and affect each other.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens next? What kind of treatment plan do they recommend for Daniel? So they've given Daniel these diagnoses. What happens now? What did they suggest he do about it?
Well, they took a multifaceted approach, which is honestly the best way to go when treating ADHD. It wasn't just about medication, but more like equipping him with a whole set of tools to deal with both the ADHD and the anxiety.
I like where this is going. So it's not about masking the symptoms, but giving him ways to actually manage his experience, right? What kind of tools are we talking about here?
Right. So therapy was a big one. Specifically, they recommended dialectical behavior therapy, DBT for short, along with mindfulness exercises and executive functioning coaching. All of these are, thankfully, pretty well researched and have been shown to be helpful for the emotional and mental gymnastics that come with ADHD.
Let's break those down a bit. What exactly is DBT, and how would it apply to someone like Daniel?
Sure. So DBT is all about building skills in 4 main areas: mindfulness, being able to tolerate distress, regulating emotions, and navigating relationships effectively. Basically, it teaches you how to stay present, how to handle tough emotions without resorting to, unhealthy coping mechanisms, and how to have healthy relationships.
Got it. So if Daniel is dealing with anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, maybe being a little hard on himself, DBT could give him some really useful skills to cope with those things.
Absolutely. It can really help someone develop self-compassion and acceptance, which can be incredibly powerful.
And what about mindfulness? That seems to be everywhere these days.
Right. So mindfulness is basically paying attention to what's happening right now in this moment without judging those thoughts and feelings. It's about noticing your thoughts, feelings, and even your physical sensations without getting totally carried away by them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can practice it through meditation, yoga, or even just taking a few minutes to focus on your breath. Simple stuff, really.
So for someone like Daniel, whose mind might be going a mile a minute, mindfulness could be a way to kind of hit the brakes and regain some control.
Exactly. It's not about clearing your mind completely, which is what a lot of people think. It's more about learning to observe your thoughts without judgment and bringing your focus back to the present moment, gently, over and over again.
Which, honestly, sounds like a skill that could benefit everyone, not just folks with ADHD. And finally, what about that executive functioning coaching? That seems particularly relevant to what we know about Daniel so far.
For sure. Executive functioning coaching is all about learning practical ways to deal with those daily challenges that often trip up people with ADHD. We're talking things like making routines, breaking down big tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks using visual aids like calendars and to-do lists, and, learning how to manage time effectively.
So it's like having a personal trainer, but for your brain. someone who can help you see your weaknesses and create a plan to get those executive functions into shape.
I love that analogy. And it's important to remember that this isn't about fixing the person with ADHD. It's about collaborating with their strengths and weaknesses to help them discover strategies that actually work for them as an individual.
Because we're all different, right?
Yeah.
What works for one person might not work for someone else.
Yeah.
So it's about finding that tailored approach.
Exactly. And on top of all that, the psychologist also suggested some things Daniel could do in his work environment, really emphasizing how helpful workplace accommodations can be.
Because sometimes even seemingly small changes to the workspace can make a big difference, right?
Absolutely. For example, having a quieter workspace, noise-canceling headphones, maybe breaking down those bigger projects into more manageable parts, having some flexibility with deadlines. These things can really reduce stress and help someone with ADHD be more productive. It's about creating an environment where they can truly excel, not just get by.
It's about working with the brain, not against it.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay, so we've got therapy, mindfulness, coaching, adjustments at work. This is shaping up to be a pretty comprehensive plan. But I'm guessing it's not always easy to put all this into practice, is it?
You're right. It does take work, dedication, and a willingness to try new things. There's no magic bullet.
Right.
But the potential payoff is huge.
And that's what's so important to remember. Daniel's story isn't just about ADHD. It's about recognizing that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and that with the right support, we can do amazing things.
Absolutely. Neurodiversity isn't a bad thing. It's about being different. And when we embrace those differences, we open ourselves up to a whole world of possibilities.
I love that. So we've really dug into Daniel's journey here, from those early signs that something was different, to the testing and diagnosis, and now to this plan for moving forward. But before we wrap up, I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What does Daniel's experience teach us about ADHD in general, and what can our listeners take away from all of this?
That's a fantastic question. One of the biggest takeaways for me is how easily ADHD, particularly the inattentive type, can go undetected, especially in people who've achieved some level of success. Here's Daniel, successful UI designer, incredibly smart, but still struggling.
And it took those struggles impacting his work and his well-being before he actually asked for help. It makes you wonder how many others are out there silently going through the same thing, thinking it's just them or that they're not good enough, when really their brain is just wired a little differently.
Exactly. And that's why we have to keep talking about this, to raise awareness and to encourage people to reach out for help if they need it. Don't wait for a crisis.
Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the signs of ADHD, knowing that it's not a personal failing, and recognizing that there is help out there, those things can be life-changing.
Totally agree. When we have information, we can stand up for ourselves, ask for support, and create a world that's more accepting of neurodiversity.
I love that. So for anyone listening, if any part of Daniel's story has resonated with you, even a little, if any of that's been ringing a bell for you, like, hold on, this sounds kind of familiar, don't brush it off. Get curious. Do some digging. Maybe talk to someone.
Exactly. Because this deep dive, it's not just about Daniel, right? It's about realizing that ADHD shows up in so many ways. It's not one size fits all.
And that's especially true for the inattentive type, which, let's be real, often gets missed entirely or, misdiagnosed as something else.
Right. It's understandable in a way because it's not always the more obvious stuff like hyperactivity or impulsivity, right? Inattentive ADHD, it's often more like internal. It's that feeling of getting sidetracked constantly, never getting organized, starting things but not quite finishing them.
It's like your brain is a web browser with 20 tabs open, and you just can't seem to close any of them no matter how hard you try.
Perfect analogy. And the thing is, a lot of people with inattentive ADHD, they get really good at compensating, finding workarounds. They develop these coping mechanisms, figure out ways to manage, and they might even excel in certain areas like how Daniel did with UI design.
But at a certain point, those workarounds only get you so far, right? Life throws more and more at you, and eventually those strategies aren't enough, and that's when the struggles become really apparent.
Exactly. Early intervention is so important, recognizing those challenges early on and finding the right support so folks can really thrive.
Which brings us back to Daniel's treatment plan. It wasn't just about making symptoms go away. It was about giving him tools to actually manage and succeed, right? The DBT, mindfulness, coaching. Those aren't just trendy terms. They actually work.
They do. These are methods that have been studied and shown to make a real difference for people with ADHD. And the key is there's no single right answer. What works for one person might not work for another, which makes finding the right strategy so important.
Exactly. It's got to be personalized.
Mm.
And sometimes that takes a little experimentation.
For sure, which is where working with a qualified professional, a therapist, or counselor who really understands ADHD can make a huge difference. They can help you sort through all the options, figure out which strategies are likely to work best, and offer support along the way. It's a journey.
Absolutely. So if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from Daniel's story, it's this. If any of this has resonated with you, if you've been thinking, wait a minute, this sounds like me, don't ignore that. Talk to someone. Explore those feelings. Knowledge is power, right? And getting to know your own brain. That's the first step to living a happier, healthier life. A life that feels more authentically you.
Couldn't have put it better myself. There's one last thing in this report that really stood out to me. It mentions, and I'm quoting here, unusual thought patterns. Not necessarily a bad thing, just, something to explore further. What'd you make of that?
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's like your intuition, it already senses there's more to uncover there. And it is intriguing. The report doesn't elaborate on exactly what those thought patterns might be, but it feels significant.
Like a little breadcrumb leading you towards something.
Yes.
So listeners, that's where our deep dive ends for today, but your journey of self-discovery, that's just beginning. Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep embracing what makes you, you.
Because those unusual qualities, those unique ways of seeing the world, those are your strengths.
They're what make you interesting. And who knows, they might just be the key to unlocking your greatest potential. This deep dive has been incredible, really thought-provoking. I hope it's given our listeners a lot to consider.
Me too. Remember to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel where RoboCast is posted every weekday. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.